In this video, you're going to learn 3 steps that you need to take to handle conflict on your worship team. Coming up. Hey, Spencer here from leadingworshipwell.com, your daily dose of practical worship leading tips. If you want to find those tips, head over to Instagram or Facebook at leadingworshipwell, where I'm posting new worship leading tips every single day. But you're here on YouTube, so go ahead, hit the subscribe button down below, and let's get into it, because today we're talking about conflict on your worship team. If you've been a part of a worship team, you might have had a little bit of conflict on there before. Maybe it's between you and somebody else. Maybe you're not the leader of the team and you didn't agree with something that they were doing, and there was a little bit of conflict there. You know, we are sinful people, so nobody's perfect. Conflict is a part of life. We want to learn how to resolve that conflict in a Christian way and in a loving way. But before I get into these 3 steps of how to actually handle conflict on your worship team, I want you to do one thing. I want you to pause this video for a second, head down to the comments, and answer this question. Have you ever had conflict on your worship team before? And how did you deal with it? Did you ignore it? Did you face it head on? Let everybody else know that their worship team is not the only worship team that has ever had conflict on it before. So pause this video as you're scrolling down to the comments, hit the like button, and leave me a comment answering that question. Thanks so much for doing that. I can't wait to see that we are not all alone. There has been conflict on pretty much every worship team, maybe small conflict, maybe big conflict, but there is going to be conflict in your worship team, and really probably just in your church in general. There is no perfect church, and so we've got to figure out how to handle this conflict. You know, leaders of anything are problem solvers. We aren't problem avoiders. Good leaders, at least, aren't problem avoiders. They are problem solvers. So a conflict represents a problem in our worship team, whether it's communication or maybe people aren't getting along. Whatever it is, there is a problem in your worship team, and you can choose to avoid it. But if we want to be good worship team leaders, then we need to address the conflict. So in this video, I want to share with you how to actually address that conflict. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to give you 3 questions to think through. And then after you answer these 3 questions, I think that you'll be prepared to solve the problem, solve the conflict. So let's get into it. The first question that you need to answer when handling conflict is this: how would I want this information to be told to me if I was on the other side of the conversation? So a conflict pops up in your team. Let's just use the example that somebody's showing up late to rehearsal, because that's probably one of the most common conflicts on your team, is somebody doesn't show up or they're not prepared. And so how do you handle that? You answer the question: if I was on the other side of this conversation, how would I want the information to be told to me? Because that's going to guard you from just lashing out. It's putting yourself in the other person's shoes. So if you did something that you probably weren't aware of, like, I don't think people consciously make the decision to be late every rehearsal, and they probably know that they're showing up late, but it's not like they're like, oh, I'm going to make my worship leader mad and show up 15 minutes late. So keep that in mind and think about that. Think about, okay, this is what happened. How would I want it to be addressed if it was me? Like, obviously you want the problem fixed, so you don't want it to be ignored. But if somebody's going to bring it up to you, you don't want them to be like, hey, I can't believe that you don't come to a worship rehearsal on time. Why are you doing this? You need to get here on time earlier. This is blah, blah, blah. You know, you do it probably nicer to yourself. You'd be like, hey, Spencer, you know, I've noticed that you've shown up late a couple times here in a row, and I was just wondering if you could show up a little bit earlier. You know, something like that. That's a good starting place, and things progress from there if they don't meet the expectation after that, but that's a different conversation. So answer the question: how would I want this information to be told to me if I was on the other side of the conversation? The second question you need to answer when handling conflict on your worship team is: what is the objective truth? Identify what is actually going on. Part of your responsibility as a leader who is a problem solver and not a problem avoider is to actually identify what the problem is and identify it clearly, because so often I think we get mad about things, but we haven't actually determined specifically what it is. And whenever you determine the objective truth, it makes it so much easier to communicate what the problem is to the person that there is a conflict on your team. So for example, the objective truth in the example that we talked about in number 1 would be, hey, our worship rehearsals start at 6:30, and I've noticed that for the past couple weeks you've shown up at 6:45. And, that's really set the rest of the worship team back. We've had to wait for you. So I was just wondering, can you show up at 6:30 from now on? Like, that's objective truth. What's the truth? The truth is our worship rehearsals start at 6:30. You've been showing up 15 minutes late. It's holding the rest of the team back. Can you show up? Like, that is, people can't argue with that. You can see that they've shown up 15 minutes late. They might have an excuse for it, but that is the objective truth. And Ephesians 4:15 says that speaking the truth in love will result in maturity of the body. And that's what we want in our worship teams, in our church in general, which is the body. But in our worship teams, we want maturity. We want people to rise to the occasion and be mature worship team members. And so the way that happens is when there's conflict, you speak the truth, the objective truth in love, and you just put it out there, because the truth shall set you free. And so you set the truth out there. People can't argue with the objective truth. And so the truth will hit where it may. And 1 Corinthians 3:6 says, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in truth. So it is actually loving to be truthful. There's no caveat to that statement. It's not like, don't love people with truth whenever it's hard to do it. And no, it just says that truth is love. So if we share the truth with people that they aren't meeting the expectations, that's the loving thing to do, because it helps our team grow in maturity. So find out what the objective truth is, and then be prepared to communicate that to the person that there's a conflict with. The third question, and I think this is the most important one, is what are the steps that lead to redemption? Think about how the conflict can be redeemed, how it can be resolved, and then identify what the steps are that somebody can take to be redeemed in that situation. Because at the beginning, I said that leaders are problem solvers. We solve problems, so we figure out not just what the problem is, but also the solution. And I think too often in our leadership, we're just problem seers and not problem solvers. Like, we can identify the problems, but then we just point them out, and that's not helping anyone when you say, hey, you've shown up late, and leave it at that. Or, hey, you've shown up, or you haven't been prepared when you've shown up on Sundays. Like, we can't just leave it at that. If we are to be good leaders, we want to solve the problem. So how do you do that? You don't just yell at the person and say, fix this. You come alongside them and try to help them fix it. So if it's being prepared to lead worship and they're not prepared, you don't just say you aren't prepared. You say, hey, I noticed you haven't been as prepared as you could be, or as the expectation that we've set. Check out the video from last week about having high expectations for your team. You want to set those expectations, then you can hold people to them. But you say, this is the expectation that we have on our team. I noticed that you haven't been meeting it. Is there anything that I can do to help you meet that expectation? Can I get you the resources earlier? Do we need to sit down and run through the songs a little bit before Sunday? Whatever it is, be a problem solver, not just a problem seer. So real quick, recap on those 3 questions. How would I want this information told to me if I was on the other side of the conversation? Number 2, what is the objective truth? Number 3, what are the steps that lead to redemption? So you put your answers to all 3 of those questions in order, and then you address the conflict. And now you're doing it in a way that's respectful to the person. You're laying out the truth, and you're offering them a solution to make things better. That's how you handle conflict in your worship team. So we've talked a lot about worship team leadership in this video, and I believe that one of the best ways that you can lead your worship team, and it probably leads to less conflict in your worship team as well, is through actually leading them, not as a musical band, that's important, but also as a team and as believers. And we want to cast vision to them. We want to highlight the expectations that we have for them. We want to raise up the importance of their position, and the best way to do that is worship team devotionals. So actually sitting down with your worship team and pouring into them, not just musically, not just so they can play a couple songs on Sunday, but actually caring about them spiritually and who they are as a person. So I've got a devotional coming out for worship leaders. It is called We Are All Worship Leaders. It's for a worship team. It's an 8-week set of devotionals where we raise up this position of worship team members as worship leaders. It's not quite out yet, but if you join the launch list, I'll send you a free devotional, and you can start this conversation about expectations with your worship team. You can raise the expectations for them. We talked about that in last week's video, and it's going to lead to less conflicts, because the more clear you are in your expectations and the more often you put it out in front of people, the more likely they'll be to latch onto it and follow it. So if you want a devotional to lead your worship team in, to start this conversation, click the link in the description below, and then get excited for when We Are All Worship Leaders, a practical worship team devotional, comes out in next week or a few weeks. I'm not sure when it's coming out yet, but when it comes out, you'll be the first to know. So click the link in the description below. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name's Spencer Cormany from leadingworshipwell.com, your daily dose of practical worship leading tips. Until I see you next time, keep leading worship well.